Panel number 2, we will take a deeper look at polling, whether pollsters got it wrong, whether they inflated the strength of Democratic candidates, what changes are in store for the polling industry, and our efforts to spread political disinformation via social media, now a permanent part of American elections. I sincerely hope not. The panel will be moderated by Lisa Benenson, who is Vice President for Communications and Strategy at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, where she leads the Brennan Center's communication strategies and initiatives, marketing and brand, and digital presence. Thank you, everybody. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you very much. Now, I was just looking, is John Anzalone on our call? Because he was going to be joining us to talk in particular about polling, but I don't think he's here yet, so we may have to wait for him. So in any case, but fortunately we have a panel here that can talk about anything. So I wanted to start out by noting that in the first 24 hours after the ballot count started on election night, the media and polling classes had declared that polling was the biggest loser. Playbook said that the industry is a wreck and it should be blown up. Lots of folks on election day were talking about embarrassed to support Trump voters who were allegedly skewing results. And others suggested that too many folks are just refusing to engage with pollsters because they don't trust the results. The president himself claimed on election night that polls had suppressed turnout among his supporters, apparently because they were then predicting a Democratic blowout. So the data and analytics guys always say that averages matter. Pollsters say the average of good polls and bad polls isn't better polls. So from all of you, I'm curious, which is it? And what do you think was really going on out there? Karen.
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I worked with Cornell Belcher, Brilliant Corners polling firm this cycle. We did Jamie Harrison's polling. We did some work for the DCCC and the Congressional Black Caucus, and just in other races that I worked on. You know, I think we always have to be mindful that polls are a snapshot in time. And I think we have the same problem this cycle as we have seen in previous cycles, where we have to be careful how much weight we put into what polls are telling us. I did some polling work actually in the middle of the season for Higher Heights for America, specifically looking, for example, at whether or not Americans in battleground states thought that Joe Biden should select a Black woman or should he select a white woman. And we were very intentional in the way we worded those polls to try to get underneath by unconscious biases. And so I think there's, you know, and I raise this to say, I think there's still an issue in some of our polling where how you ask the questions can also skew the kinds of answers that you get. And again, I think the most important thing is to take it as, you know, a piece of information, a snapshot in time, but I think it also, you know, it cannot be replaced by all the other inputs of information that you would get on a campaign, for example, in terms of what are you hearing when people are knocking on doors? What are you hearing when, and some people were knocking on doors. What are you hearing when you are having those phone conversations from people? What are you, you know, what kinds of inputs are you getting? What are you seeing in terms of the activity, like an early vote, in terms of who's turning out and where they're turning out? And what is that telling you? How is that matching up with what the polling is saying? And then my last thing, and this is something I talked a lot about after the 2016 race that I'll just mention, is I think too much of our polling, and particularly, and I think we have to distinguish between the polling that is done inside organizations and campaigns and the sort of public polling, because that is done very differently. And they're trying to find very different answers. And I certainly think one of the issues is they're very focused in the what, but not the why. And when we don't understand the why, we're not really going to be able to find the trends and understand what's going to change over time. And one of the things we did in Jamie Harrison's race, I'm a big believer in values-based messaging. Learned that early on. Stacey Abrams, much of her success in Georgia has been about values-based messaging, and the fact that, you know, again, understanding the why helps you better understand the what in terms of what is going on, and frankly, get better numbers.
Yep. So Anzo, welcome.
Hey.
Welcome to the team. Glad to see you here. For everyone watching, John Anzalone ran polling for the president-elect. And John, the question on the table here was, is the death of polling been prematurely predicted? There were lots of stories the day after that somebody needs to blow up the house. What do you think?
Yeah, listen, I think that there's a couple things here. Not to be a defensive pollster, but it is kind of a bullshit narrative for a couple reasons. One is that first acknowledge that polling is really hard. And so we're always working to innovate, given the low response rates, non-response bias, et cetera, to do better. And I think you saw, quite frankly, that we are doing better. The second thing is, that let's acknowledge that in 2016 and 2020, different than 2018. So there certainly is potentially a Trump interference that gets in the way of what is at least perceived as missed polling. The third thing is, and I think that this is really important, what I do or your husband does and professional campaign pollers on the Democratic and Republican side is so much different than what the public polls for media consumption. Like, we spend a tremendous amount of innovation, a tremendous amount of money, what we do to get non-college educated white voters, rural voters, bilingual phone banks for Latinos, et cetera, is incredibly expensive, is incredibly labor intensive. We're doing likely voters, et cetera. That's very different than the dozens and dozens of shitty polls that you see in the public who are not using great procedures, et cetera, and they get dumped into these aggregators. And I certainly think that it is a problem. So, you can't see our polls because they're, for our campaigns, but we didn't see the big margin differences that you saw in the public polling. The other thing is that everyone needs to Google margin of error, right? I mean, the fact is that, if the aggregators showed that Biden was up, 1.5 on average in North Carolina, and he lost by 1.5 in North Carolina, that 3 points is not only within the margin of error, it's half of the margin of error. That if your margin of error is 3.5%, guess what? The spread could be 7 points. The other thing is, I think that we learn certain things about these elections, and especially for Democrats. Karen was talking about Harrison in South Carolina. I do John Bel Edwards in Louisiana. I do Roy Cooper in North Carolina. If we're not at 50%, we're not going to win. And so if you take a look at where Joe Biden was in the aggregator polls and you look at his results, in North Carolina, he was at 49, and guess what? He got 48.6, right? In Michigan, he was at 51, and he got 50.5. And so there's a lesson to be learned that the margin is not as important as where your candidate is, because Democrats in battleground states get what they poll. And I think that becomes, really, really important here.
So somebody in the questions has just asked one that I think is interesting for us to take on as we go into this conversation, which is, what evidence is there that the money being given to campaigns ensures better outcomes and a stronger democracy? And let's apply that in particular to polling. Why does it matter?
I'm looking at the chairman here. I'm like, come on, man, you ran for office. Are you just like?
What do you got to say?
Look, the money piece is a significant part, and a lot of donors give because they want an outcome. But I think John has just laid out why that's an improbable reality. I mean, because there's so many factors, and Karen, you put your finger on the most important one, which is always, for me, from my very beginnings in politics, the most important question you should ever get an answer to is why, because everything else feeds off of the why. And one of the problems I have with a lot of the polling, and John will probably smack me down for this a little bit, but in my, the work that I did both as a candidate and then, of course, as the chairman at a county level, a state level, and nationally, I've always pressed my pollsters to get at that question, because it is, at the end of the day, the clearest indicator of where the population of voters are. I agree with John. There's a lot of crappy pollsters and polling out there. And that's unfortunate because they gum up the works. John is doing private polling for his candidate. Those results we're not going to see. Unfortunately for him, XYZ company is doing something that they're paid to put out, to sort of craft a narrative and to sort of lead the public into thinking a certain thing or a certain way about their candidate or an issue. And then, of course, when the results come in, poor John is sitting there explaining why the numbers don't add up, and we're all sitting there going, it's because of all the crap that was put into the mix. So I think the first thing the pollsters have to do is try to very clearly delineate as a community where the bad actors are. We know who the good players are inside the business. We know who the good actors are. I think there's got to be a greater exploration of that. I'm right now engaged in conversations here in Maryland with some of my hard Trump folks about stuff that just isn't factually true. And it just, I don't know what, I don't know how. And they're like, well, they're citing this stuff. I'm like, that's not real. Yeah. Well, this poll said, well, no, that poll was wrong. I mean, so you've got these dual realities that are at play here, and reputable companies like John and campaigns that are trying to sort of navigate in this space are having a very hard time doing it. And it still, for me, goes back to the question why. If you can fashion polling around that, it's harder to then muck up the answers on the other side, because it's actually going to reflect more of the reality than what we've seen in 18 or now 20.
But I think, going to that point, if I may, just to kind of get to that question, maybe a slightly different way. Again, I appreciate that, Michael, because I agree the why really matters. I also think you brought up something very important. The source of the poll matters, right? I mean, if it's from the sugar company and the poll says sugar is good for you, we have to be, as consumers of information, we also have to be mindful of where the information is coming from. And to this point, and John can speak to, I think his point was so well taken, that internal polls are, and what you're seeing internally, that is used, that is very important to democracy, because that is used by campaigns and a candidate to get a feel for where voters are and what the climate of the environment that you're running in is like. And look, for some candidates, and particularly we know Black women have a very hard time raising money, in part because polling is a way that is used to show viability. And it's not always the only thing that should be used. I remember, we're all hailing Stacey Abrams, who I love dearly, and I worked for her early on in her gubernatorial race when nobody would give her money, because they said the polling shows it's impossible that a Black woman can do what you're going to try to do. It can't be done. No way Georgia will ever turn blue. And she, God love her, had not just polling, but a lot of other longitudinal data to show why, and the why that she believed that there was a case to be made. And so I think part of it is the source of the polling and what's the intention of the polling. Again, when you're talking about something like, hey, if we invest in a 10-year plan, we could turn Georgia blue, that's different than saying, hey, we're trying to sell a narrative that fits a certain, narrative that we want to be able to go out and sell, and using polling as a messaging tool rather than as an instrument to try to understand, again, what's happening on the ground. That's not to say we don't do message testing in polling to try to understand what resonates with people and what doesn't. But again, I think we just have to understand that it's all very important to democracy. It's just polling is used in very different ways, and we have to be aware of that as well when we're looking at the results and trying to understand what those results are telling us.
I also think that, Karen, you made me think of this, like every state isn't the same. There's some states that are really difficult to poll. Florida is one of it where I've polled for years. The Latino community is not homogeneous. You got to use bilingual phone banks, highest percentage of cell phones in any ethnic group. You probably need to do text to web to get younger African Americans, for example. Florida's like 5 different states and a couple different countries in a way, right? In terms of how you approach it. For some reason, Michigan, never really what we would consider a good batch of state public polls. Don't know why, but that's the case. You can say the same thing about Nevada. And so, there's some states that are just for, again, I could probably give you theories, easier to poll. Georgia, everyone seemed to have, right on. I mean, it was basically a dead even race, and it turned out to be a dead even race. But again, there were dynamics there that were going on that I believe was the hangover from Abrams, where African Americans were looking to settle a score about a race that they feel was taken from her. And quite frankly, you don't have the volatility with whites. I mean, if you can get to your 30 or 31%, you're probably not going to go any farther, right? You know what I'm saying? Where in Michigan, you'll see movement away with non-college whites. So every state's a little different, has its own little quirks on how you would approach that. And clearly, some states have a bigger universe of if you want to say misses or swings than other states.
So Rob, let me ask you, you've played a senior role in many candidates races over the years working with the Republican Party. Did you see anything in this election that surprised you, that a turn that you didn't expect?
Yeah, thanks for having me today. It's always a great discussion after the election, and something I think in many ways starts the conversation for the next battle, but it's a good way for combatants to get together and express ideas that aren't in 140 characters that sometimes lead to productive outcomes. So thank you for hosting this, and this is great. I think I've spoken to a lot of Republicans. We thankfully made a bet at the firm. We're a bipartisan firm, and both our Republicans and Democrats felt the public polling was off. And so we were counseling our clients that we had to plan for a close election and what the impacts would be, lame duck and governing. I think the challenge when I talk to a lot of Republicans, there's a lot of frustration. Republicans, and I'm sure Democrats, are told on their first campaign, polling is the only scientific thing you'll do on a campaign. Everything else is everyone's opinion. And so that's really your compass. And I believe everything John's saying to be accurate because he won. And winners get to say that. But there's a lot of frustration among the Republicans because the Republican results of 2012 are disappointing, and we blame the polling. And we didn't blame all the pollsters. I'm going to focus on just the Republican side. And we were told we didn't have enough cell phones. So in 2014, we fixed that. And then when the polling was off again by 7 points, worse in battleground states, we were told, well, we didn't have the right mix. And then in 2016, it was we didn't screen for education. We didn't have enough state level polling. So I think that's been a huge frustration for the Republicans. And I know there's a lot of folks saying, no, we had it right. But if you look at the spending decisions, the Republican Party has to reconcile that we're always going to get outspent. We've been outspent the last decade, ever since President Obama got out of public financing of campaigns. That was a seminal moment for American politics, and we've seen the explosion. I think we're going to be north of 15 billion spent on campaigns this year. And the Republicans, if they want to continue to govern as the majority party, they have to really think about two things. One, these are games of inches, not anymore. There are no blowouts anymore. And two, if you're going to get outfunded, you have to have better data. You have to have better looks into where the electorate is going to be. It's easy to say now, as Republicans, we had good numbers internally, but then you look at last minute spending decisions, say after Labor Day or after Columbus Day, and it doesn't reflect this internal polling, and it maybe reflects we spent some money in places that we could have been more efficient. It doesn't mean we should throw all of our pollsters out and they're all bad. What it means is we have to crack this. And it's really frustrating on the strategy side when you feel like you can't trust the numbers. And I agree with the sentiments of Michael Steele that polling has become clickbait. It's super cheap now with digital polling. It's super cheap, super fast. You can get a 1,000 person sample for less than 15,000, and you can generate a lot of interest at your website. And it does gum up the works. And then, so people start looking at RCP averages and saying, this is the truth. This is what's happening. And it is a little frustrating for the profession of polling because you're right. I mean, I think you can gauge sentiment, but when people say head to head, here's where Biden and Trump were on a public or a media poll, I don't think anyone serious really takes that into account. But the problem with that is you've seen this kind of weaponization of polling as an advocacy tool. And that's become a real problem that, the classic case with the Cuccinelli race for governor, where there was polling all summer that said there was no way he could win. And then right before the election came, there was a bunch of polling that says it was a super close race. And as a result, our candidate was underfunded, he was underorganized, and we lost by a few points. And there's a sense among Republicans that with the polling continuing to show a bias against Republicans, that it's unreliable, but also it's designed to suppress donor enthusiasm first and then voter enthusiasm second. And the real frustration is we've seen even Republican pollsters, Herd, and for those who are watching, Herd is where they see that 10 polls that says a candidate's up or down 10, they get a poll that says their candidate's only down 2. So they herd the numbers, so they kind of turn the dials a little bit to get closer to the herd. And that's really incredibly frustrating. And, the Trafalgar Group is kind of the celebrity pollsters of the moment right now, because they were willing to go against the herd multiple times, and they've been more right than wrong. And, I don't say this because to be an indictment against my friends on the Republican side of our polling, but it is frustrating when you do see Republican polling firms that are consistently with the herd getting consistent results. And I just know how hard it is to win these campaigns. And when you have bad data, it's extremely frustrating. And I know, like I said, the Republicans I've spoken to are extremely frustrated and they don't know what to do. And they don't know how to combat it. So, and the other challenge is that there's an upstream effect where you do have good results and your donors or your voters or your constituents don't believe you. Or I think on the previous panel, there was a discussion about someone needed to go to President Trump and say, you need to change, get off your message, it's not working. Well, it's hard to do that when the polling isn't considered credible. So it is hard to kind of, as strategists, to drive a candidate to a certain direction if they're going to not believe what you put in front of them. So I lay all those frustrations out, but I'll close on a positive note, which is when I saw Biden in Georgia, I thought to myself, Anzalone must be crazy. Why does he have Biden in Georgia? I never believed Georgia was close. I knew this was going to be a close race, but so I congratulate him on seeing Biden tighter than I saw it, because I just always felt that was about 5 to 6 in our favor, and it was prescient that Anzo got that one right and put his candidate in the right state at the right time.
So you're throwing me one bone. Thanks, Rob.
It's good to be king for a minute, Anzo. But you went to a point that I think is really interesting for this other piece of our discussion, which is looking at social media. So if polling is clickbait, as Rob just said, we don't have a journalist on this panel, but we do have people who spend a lot of time on television talking about it. And we have Patrick here, who also spends a lot of time thinking about this. What should the media be doing differently, if anything, when it comes to reporting on polls?
I think it's tough as a guy who studies public opinion for a living and is not looking at the private polls conducted by campaigns, but certainly looking at all the public polls and the high quality academic polls that will be coming out from this election, as they do from every election. I think there's both good and bad things to draw from this election. As I think all of you know, the American Association for Public Opinion Research did a big post-mortem study after 2016 to figure out what went wrong with the polls. And the two big problems they found that year were that there weren't enough people without a college education in these samples, and that there were a bunch of late deciding voters who broke decisively toward Trump, especially in some of the big battleground states. I don't think either of those two problems was true this year. We had lots of high quality polls in the states that were very, very assiduous about matching their samples to estimates of turnout by education from CPS and other sources. And then the exit polls that I've looked at from various sources do not show any evidence of late deciding voters moving toward Trump. Pretty much 50-50. I don't know, John or Rob, if you guys saw anything different in your private polling, but certainly the public polling does not indicate that there were any late deciding voters toward Trump. So what that suggests is that there was a real problem with perhaps likely voter screens. And that makes sense that that would be true this year, right? Because the pandemic, of course, is disrupting how people vote and decide, and disrupting how they decide they're going to vote. It also disrupts who's home, right? And is answering phone calls. So even in these, what we think are going to be the highest quality live interviewer phone polls that we tend to rely upon to look at as sort of the best indicators of good independent polling research, it's probably distorting who's answering the phone and who's willing to pick up the phone in terms of who's home. And, you know, the folks who are working from home are college educated professionals, you know, for the most part. So that may also have been changing things around a bit. And then the other thing is, this is an incredibly high turnout election, which then becomes very, very hard to model, right? So on the one hand, I think there were good efforts to try to solve the problems of 2016 that messed up the state polling. But 2020, in the polling industry's defense, presented some really, really tough challenges that evidently it did not overcome. I'm looking at a table here comparing polling results with actual results, and particularly in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Ohio, Iowa, Michigan. You know, the polling was just so far off that you have to start to wonder how it happened again, and how it seemed to happen in a pattern that was so similar geographically to what we saw.
You know, Patrick, I think there's a couple big problems with the public polling, and there's probably too simplistic of an answer from 16's autopsy that, oh, you have to get, you know, you didn't get enough white non-college educated voters. Our own autopsy was a little different. You could go back to our 16 polls and just reweight non-college whites, you wouldn't get any difference. And so you have to do a little better than that. And I think that there's a difference between maybe a campaign pollster and a media pollster. I don't know, because you never know how they do their process. But it was really also about getting the right type of non-college educated voter, right? You have you were getting too many people in the service industry and not enough non-college whites in the non-service industry, people who work with their hands, who work in a factory, who drive a truck like my dad, et cetera. That was number one problem. And so again, we do a lot of work to make sure that we're getting the right mix of non-college educated whites. The second is, in our autopsy, we found that when you're getting rural interviews, that often the rural interviews you were getting were too educated, right? That is a problem. And so you're in a rural county, maybe you're getting that interview from the county seat or whatever, and the education level is too high. And so there's certain fixes there. The third thing, and I think this is really important, how many media polls do multimodal interviews? The best you can get is you're doing an online, or you're doing cell, all cell, or you're doing cell and landline. Is there any media poll that you know that are doing 30% of landline, 60% of cell phones, and 10% text to web? Well, let me just tell you what, when you look at a crosstab and you look at those results from text to web, which are super Republican, Rob, right? I mean, you want your clients doing multimodal, right? And then it's difficult to figure out what maybe that mix is, but I'm just telling you, when you look at a crosstab and you're seeing the Biden Trump, or you're looking at, pick the Senate race, McSally, Kelly, the difference in cell phones, landlines, text to web, and online, you want that mix.
Yeah, I know Survey USA was probably one of the few independent pollsters that was doing a lot of text to web, and they tended to find pretty good results for Biden. I don't know, John, did you see any evidence of a late breaking move to Trump in your private?
We saw, the answer is, that was the other thing I was going to point out. There were, again, I can't reveal a lot.
I know.
Your client things, but were there states where, from our second to last poll to our last poll, we saw movement? Yes, which means that there was going to probably be, if there's a trajectory, there's a trajectory, which means there would have been continuing to be movement down in those states. Florida's the perfect example.
Can I just raise a couple of other things, though, that I think we have to take on, and that is, and this is something that we found, and I said this and somebody thought this was brilliant. I don't really think it's very brilliant at all. Most polling is written by white men. So you're asking women, so one of the things that I have found is that sometimes the reaction that people have to the answer is because it's like, well, that language doesn't really resonate with me because I'm a woman, I don't talk like that, or I'm Black and that's not how I think about things. Like when you what we found in some places where you tease out what's happening in a focus group to what's happening in a poll, sometimes there was a reaction to the language because it was like, okay, whatever, I'll just say whatever because I don't know what that means, right? Or we found in places where, for example, African American and Latino voters would say, yes, they intend to vote. They didn't admit, they admitted in a different section, they weren't sure how it worked. So I think I say this to say, I think as our country becomes more diverse and our electorate is more diverse, we also have to be to bring in a lot of different thoughts about how we are asking questions, what questions we are asking. I mean, I'll give you another example. A lot of polls were asking questions in the Veepstakes about, a white woman versus a Black woman. Well, nobody's going to say they don't think a Black woman is qualified. They're just not going to answer that question that way. There are certain ways, and I can't divulge how we did it, that you have to do to kind of give the person a little bit of cultural distance from that question, because you don't want to answer that question by saying, well, I'm not racist. I'm not saying a Black person couldn't be vice president. But you're not necessarily going to get the true answer if you're not asking it a little bit of a different way. And so I just say that to say, I mean, you guys know the math far better than I do. I feel like what I know is messaging and understanding, again, the why. And it just struck me also, and as an example, in 2016, one of the things that we found out after was that when people were saying they were worried about their child's their future, they weren't just talking about the economy. They were talking about what Trump was saying, which was those people are taking their jobs. Those people are taking their slots in college because of affirmative action. But if the question you asked is, are you worried about the future of the economy? You're only getting you get an answer and you get a number, but you don't necessarily understand what's really going on there in terms of what's going to then impact voting behavior.
I know Karen doesn't want to necessarily get into the minutia of what they did and how the secrets, but I'll share what I did in 2006 on this very point, and it really gets to the why and why it makes a difference in how you ask the question and who's asking the question. So in 2006, I'm sitting Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, decided to run for the U.S. Senate, federal race. People look at federal versus state races very differently. You have to understand that as a pollster. You need to know the difference between someone running for a federal office versus state office. That's the first thing. So when we got into it, I asked my pollsters, I said, I have two questions I want back to back. And this ties into the Bradley race in California and the Virginia governor's race a few years before. And the first question, and I wanted to back to back, was, would you vote for an African American for the United States Senate? And the answer came back 74% yes. The second question was, would your neighbor vote for an African American for the United States Senate? And that answer came back 43% yes.
There you go, boom.
So now I knew where I stood.
That's right.
Because, the question, I know I couldn't get you, will you vote for a Black man? Or why won't you vote for a Black man? I knew that I couldn't get into that lane. That wasn't going to be a conversation starter. So the way you ask the questions as pollsters is important. And to be quite frank and honest about it, you got to have people in the room who think like that to ask the question. So, you can't have a bunch of men, I don't care if they're white, Black, or otherwise, asking questions about women and how they feel and look at things. Just as you can't have a bunch of women asking questions about men. So in other words, you've got to get the right mix in the room in formatting the questions so that you can get as close as you can to the right answers when you go out into the public and you're trying to do this cross-pollination of players, gay and lesbian, men, white, educated, uneducated, suburban, city, whatever, to get that fixed. And putting those pieces together, I think we can begin to get closer to exactly how an electorate feels on any topic at any time. Because again, going back to how we started the conversation, you're revealing a little bit more of the why.
I wanted to just touch on a question that one of our listeners asked, and you all will have the answers to this as well, but she asks about the money, given the money and the power that polling organizations have within campaigns, has there ever been an instance where the polling organization intentionally gave erroneous information in an attempt to manipulate the outcome? Now, let me just start this by saying pollsters who work, and I do think this is important and something a lot of people don't understand if they're not in the field or married to someone in the field. Pollsters who are running campaigns have to get to the right answers or they're not doing their jobs. So it's not like they're going to push away the bad information. They need to know, exactly as Michael just noted, they need to know the real answers so they can help their candidates. Any of you want to take this one on, and then I want to move on to something else.
I don't think they intentionally. I mean, I think Karen made a point. Like if you get a poll from an interest, shocking the results are favorable to that interest in an advocacy setting. So if I think that's a little different. I think it's tricky. Did people call me this year and say, "Hey, I have Tillis at this, and I think it should be that. What do you think?" Yeah, they call. I think this number's too high, too low. And it's not that they're saying I want to give the world or my campaign or my clients bad intel. It's just a tough thing. I mean, John Anzalone just he highlighted in 30 seconds the challenge of Michigan polling or trying to really get an accurate cell. I mean, I think the independent cell was corrupted the whole past year in public polling because of economics. It's expensive to find the right mix of independents, and it's cheaper just to set up some algorithm and turn it loose. So I don't think it's a desire for the wrong result. I think it's actually in the quest to be right. You see things like herding or kind of reweighted numbers because they're trying to get it right, and they're afraid that they did something came back on the poll that was inaccurate. So I've never talked to a pollster that said, "Man, I really regret giving that answer." I think they just try to do the best they can.
I mean, listen, with your clients, you want to be as frank as possible. And, one of my oldest clients loves to tell the story that he introduces me as the guy who told him that he was going to lose. I mean, that's just, that's where you have to be to make good decisions. And I think Rob pointed to it earlier. I mean, polling's also helping make resource decisions, right? Which is really important in all of this. But again, media firms are doing polling to be Nostradamus, right? We're doing polling for message development, for targeting. And yes, we want to get it right. Rob brings up the Tillis Cunningham race, which is really, really important. I have, for my entire career, done a lot of blue dogs, done a lot of Southern polling. I live in Montgomery, Alabama. Not saying I understand it all that much better than other people, but here's what I've learned. If you're looking at a bunch of North Carolina data in October, you might see Cunningham up by a couple points. And the media is just saying that is a lead, that he's going to win. Well, no. If you're a seasoned pollster, you're knowing that if a Democrat in North Carolina is not at 50%, you are going to lose. And that's what we believed, right? And that's just that, again, we don't get any points for that, but that's what we're telling clients because we want to be honest with our analysis. But that's never going to be the spin of a media poll in North Carolina on Tillis Cunningham. End of story.
Yeah.
He got what he polled. That's what happens in the South with a Democrat, even if he might have been up a couple points in a poll. It wasn't that the poll was necessarily off. It was how you interpret that poll.
So let's move on to talking a little bit about social media and the role it plays. There have been and are currently claims being made that there was a blue wave claimed in polling and that depressed turnout. But there were also much more serious things that went on in our social media over the last 6 months. In September, U.S. intelligence officials warned us that because of the pandemic, it would probably take some days for the results of the presidential election to emerge, and that foreign adversaries might exploit that delay to spread false information. At the same time, conservative media, Fox, Sinclair, Breitbart, and a constellation of right-wing influencers have also been part of a disinformation powerhouse spreading that kind of information. Today, in real time, President Trump's campaign is planning a messaging blitz to fuel its argument, which is unsupported by any evidence, that the president's second term is being stolen from him through corrupt vote counts in battleground states. What do we do with a social media that now has the power to make these claims? Do you see any? I mean, we know that Facebook and Twitter late in the game took some aggressive steps to label misinformation, but more Americans than ever are getting their news on social media. What do we do in a democracy to try to continue to make our democracy work when we are faced with this flood of misinformation?
Can I say one thing that Anzo and I were, we emailed about, we all emailed about, there was, I don't think many of us really thought there was going to be a blue wave. I think that was a bit of a media narrative. Certainly I didn't, you know, maybe that is my PTSD from 2016 and 2018, but I did not think there was going to be a blue wave. And I think the reality is we had some tough house races in some tough places. And certainly it looked good. I think the bigger story is just the voting wave that we got. Frankly, I think that's what we should focus on. The fact that in the middle of a pandemic, Americans came out to vote and voted by mail in record numbers. And how do we make it easier for people to vote going forward so that we get that kind of turnout again and again and again? That being said, I think your question, this question about social media is very troubling. I think I read somewhere that, so at this point, Trump has 87 million followers and he tweets something like 1,000 times a week or something, and that each tweet is retweeted at least 17,000 times. So just think on order of magnitude, the universe in terms of controlling access to information. And there've been I've seen some research that says that some of his followers, that's where they get their information, right? They don't necessarily look at outside sources. I think it's very troubling. And I think it was good to see some of the organizations take some steps early, you know, sort of late in the game, as you pointed out. But I think we're going to really need to have, I hate to say the R word, but better regulation or better measures in place. I mean, these are not, you know, these platforms now provide information that people make life decisions based on. And so I think there is a real responsibility to try to ensure that the information they're getting is accurate, in the same way you would expect when you call a nurse at the hospital for medical advice. You expect that that's going to, you know, my daughter's temperature is at this point, should I bring her in? You should have some way of knowing that this information, again, we have to be, you know, discriminate consumers, but certainly things that are flat out not true, like the lizard people and QAnon, you know, there has to be a line somewhere where we're point there. I mean, there are not alternate facts. Let's put it that way.
I think that the social media piece relative to campaigns, policy making, polling, all of the various pieces that make up our political system, and even more broadly speaking, cultural system, is a blessing, a curse, and a cudgel. It is a blessing in that more of our citizens are engaging. And they are, you know, getting out there and expressing opinions that were heretofore kind of reserved for that, you know, the end of the bar conversation at 2 a.m. Now it's expressed at 2 p.m. and over again. But the fact is there's greater engagement and better conversation in some sense that people are having it, and they're kind of broadening their horizons in that standpoint. It is a curse in that how narrow those horizons can often become, in that we then trap ourselves into this tribal community, in which we, you know, venues like, or platforms like Facebook become, you know, sort of the home base for a group of us, you know, who kind of all think alike and feel alike and sound alike and, you know, talk alike and walk alike, you know. And so there's this environment in which there's learning stops. information gets stunted. And then things begin to germinate in a way that creates the kind of crazy that we've seen play out. Conspiracy theories tend to have equal footing and relevance as the news of the day, the actual news of the day. And you find our legitimate media outlets, regardless of how people see their political orientation, having to battle in this space to kind of get correct information in front of the country, which is then being buffeted by this incorrect information. And that leads to the cudgel, that it becomes a thing that beats the crap out of people, out of politicians, out of candidates, out of political parties, and beats them back so badly that they find themselves frozen in place. And then that affects how policy is actually made. When you're looking over your shoulder and say, I can't get out here and stand with my Republican colleague or my Democratic colleague to advance this issue because there are all these people on social media with this cudgel that are really ready to beat the mess out of me if I do. And in those rare instances where it works, and I can tell you, for example, on the criminal justice reform and other issues like that, opportunity zones, the background work to sort of smooth out the edges with the basis, the relative basis, so that this side doesn't get excited and that side doesn't get excited because it may skew a little bit more this way or that way. While that may be good, it also tells you a lot about the power of social media writ large that is being used by various constituencies as a cudgel to beat down a lot of the progress and opportunity for civic-minded leaders to kind of get into that space and govern. It is going to be a challenge for Vice President, now President-elect Biden, because instead of a President, Trump with a Twitter account, it is former President Trump with a Twitter account, and all of those followers being stoked. We saw what he did on birtherism long after it was disproven, and so forth. It had reached such a manic state that even today, there's still people who believe that President Obama was born someplace other than the United States. So that's the power of it.
Can I add, Michael, that, the President Trump's Twitter account is the tip of the iceberg. Like, when you're in a presidential campaign, you see a lot of things that you don't want to see, which is disinformation reports by race and ethnicity coming from Trump and his allies. And this is not like the one or two Pinocchios that you see in the Washington Post, right, on some policy issue. This is like bad stuff that is made up on a personal level, et cetera, et cetera. And we see just a small, Patrick knows this, we see a small amount of it. And it's different for every ethnic and race. WhatsApp is like, a big place where disinformation has been spread by Trump and his allies with Latinos, et cetera, et cetera. It is, I believe it's an epidemic. I don't know what you do about it. I don't know if you can do anything about it, but if you see the reports that some of these firms put out on disinformation, it is really distressing, incredibly distressing. And it's not, Biden's tax policy. It is, right? It is really bad personal stuff.
And there was a whole effort, the disinformation war room that was put together by a number of the women's organizations, Ultraviolet, Emily's List, how it was part of it, particularly to focus on the attacks that we knew would come on whoever the woman VP would be, and certainly when it was Kamala Harris. And can't even repeat some of the things that people would say, and you would never want your child to hear or see such a thing. It was so disgusting. And unfortunately, to John's point, it's going to continue because it's living in an environment where, I don't know how you stop it, but it is really distressing. And the best way in some ways to stop it was to just ignore it as best you can to try to, and it is much deeper. I'll be brief on this, but there is a whole misinfo chain that goes from Fox News to right-wing, sites to fringe sites, back around that is really distressing.
So Rob, can I ask you a question? In listening to this and thinking about the power of social media, what impact does this have? Because the far reaches of social media are not necessarily representative of the Republican Party. But what impact does this have on a post-Trump Republican Party? Or is there no post-Trump Republican Party because of this social media issue?
Well, I mean, you have to be a little careful here. We're hearing what I would say is a center-left critique of social media. I could make the same critiques on the right side, the misinformation, the disinformation, whether it comes from CBS, NBC, and trickles down, or from a bot with 12 followers. You see it in a bipartisan way. And so many times you'll be on Twitter or you'll be on a social media site, and the mob has ruled and decided what is, and these are sites dominated, statistically speaking, by center-left users, that the mob has decided something to be fact, and something that was a person who raised their hand and said, I disagree, is discounted, is destroyed, and then weeks later they turned out to be right. It is frustrating to be on these, to see some of that as a Republican. And when you talk to Republicans, that's a big concern. And I think when you see, and it's tough, you have a private company that acts as a public utility. I think Karen said it's almost like a hospital or something. It acts as a public utility, and in the last week they're censoring and throttling the President of the United States. They're throttling Republican senators. It begs the question, what is free speech and who has the right to say it when a private company is making these decisions? Now it's their property, they can do what they want. That said, I think you're gonna see the rise of tribal social media now. We're already starting to see it. And is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of in the Anzo camp. I have a huge family. I have a ton of friends around the country who, I'm kind of their DC guy, and the discussions on both sides aren't super helpful and not super fact-based, but I get them, and I get the tweets, and I get the texts, and I get the calls. And I just think it's corrosive. And I mean, in some ways it's great that people are engaged and they're thinking about these things and they're thinking about the future of the country and who they believe and why they believe. But I just think it's really hard because people get so passionate about it. And I think if they felt comfortable with their news source, be it left or right, center, whatever, they wouldn't be searching for the truth. And I think that's something we have to think about. And I also think the one thing that has kind of freaked me out the last 5 years is how much I've learned about people's personal opinions who are journalists. I don't know. I guess they have a right to free speech too, but when people hire us, we have over 60 clients. They kind of know my biases with regards to politics, and they choose to hire or not. And I don't know if that's a good thing for the democracy. I don't know if it's a good thing for journalism. As someone who believes in the importance of it, it does make it easy for critics to say, here's a tweet from a year ago where someone said something that was personal. Therefore, we can discount their body of work in this story. I don't know. The line between advocacy and education is getting blurred with social media, and that kind of scares me. That said, I think it's critical. I think it's important. I think we need it. We're not getting rid of it. So I don't really know how to fix it, but I do feel like you're starting to see some groups say, let's take like a fast or a ban or throttle ourselves on social media. I'm not sure that's ever going to happen, but sometimes I'm sure we all have that friend where you're like, you just need to get off Twitter and go walk outside today. Like, you need to get off this. You're literally driving me crazy. You're driving yourself crazy. And I don't think that's a good thing. So, sorry, I'll stop there, but it's just a challenge.
Be a Democrat and live in Montgomery, Alabama, Rob. I kind of get the other side.
You're a Republican.
Do we need a fairness doctrine for social media? Is that even possible?
I think the market corrects itself. It did on TV, it did on radio. The marketplace will morph. And I think, you know, you have to believe in the free market and it'll fix itself.
Yeah, I agree
think
with.
I was just because I think it's also rough in that you know, somebody who looks at the national media and has the sense that it is liberal is right. I mean, so this goes to Rob's point, which is, you know, if you look at surveys of journalists, overwhelmingly Democratic, overwhelmingly identify as liberal. And so even though I think most journalists do a great job of remaining neutral in their reporting and how they present the news, there is kind of this sense that the establishment with regard to media and my business, academia, is full of liberals. And so it's sort of the side that is presenting the facts is also the side that's stocked with liberals. And so I think that's one of the reasons why social media has such appeal to anyone who feels disenchanted or disengaged from the national conversation, because it has a kind of rhetoric and attitude and pose that just, you know, thumbs their nose at this establishment that feels really out of touch. And that, I think, is absolutely one of the big currents in American culture right now.
Yeah, I think Patrick just made the point I was going to make excellently, as academics should, right? He laid it out there. Because it goes to the why. Again, why have conservatives found their first home and love in talk radio? Why have they now found their home in the space of social media? And no one really cares to get the answer to the why. It's because when everybody was fawning over, you know, Uncle Walter and Walter Cronkite and all of those, you know, media giants in the 1960s who were telling us about the war in Vietnam and telling us about the economy and telling us about the social change that was, you know, hitting the land, we didn't hear our voices in the conversation. We weren't part of that narrative. No one ever bothered to ask a conservative in the 1960s, so how do you feel about the war in Vietnam? Or how do you feel about Johnson's explosion of government programs now known as the Great Society? You know, that's going to cost us billions and billions of dollars. No one bothered to ask them. And so at a certain point, you just kind of go, well, okay, I'll just check out. I don't care. I don't. And you see that the system is tilted against you. And so these narratives, these aren't new narratives for a lot of conservatives around the country. This is a 50-year-old story, you know, from the dawn of the media age, where it was decided by somebody that part of the population doesn't have anything to contribute or have anything to say, and we're not going to spend the time or the money putting that voice in the narrative. And so you want to understand why there was a Rush Limbaugh is because he took the risk and said, I'm going to carve out this space, and damn it, I'm going to take these 3 hours every day on this network, and I'm going to talk about the things that matter to us. And I remember, you know, starting my political career in the 1980s, turning on every day, 3 o'clock, WMAL. I was listening to Rush Limbaugh because I felt that this was a place where I had some resonance. And what Ronald Reagan was talking about, William F. Buckley was talking about, and what all these conservative thinkers was talking about, he was contextualizing it into the economy and into social constructs, into politics. And so social media is just now the next elevation of that for a lot of conservatives, because in many cases, they still don't hear or see their voices represented on media. That's why Donna Brazile is on Fox and I'm on MSNBC. And we try to have these discussions. Now, the last 4 years have been more about personality than policy, okay? And what I am excited about in the Biden era, and I've had this conversation with Biden, even though I showed my support for him, is that when you come out with crazy, I'm going to talk about it. I'm not going to stand for it. I want to have that debate around these big policy ideas on these platforms. And I think more and more that conservative and center-right citizens out there feel that these networks and these platforms are giving equal time and share to their point of view. I think you'll see less dependency to Rob's point. The market will then self-correct itself.
Well, I think there's something really interesting in the since 2016, when a bunch of former Obama folks got together and started Crooked Media, which raised $32 million just in the third quarter for progressive candidates. And along with groups like Supermajority and other groups, representing more people of color, ran really powerful get out the vote campaigns. And so you look at what Stacey Abrams did. I know, talking to John Favreau and Tommy Vietor, they very much, as they were starting Crooked Media, thought to themselves, we need a counter to Fox News, but it's not going to be a TV network. It's going to be this. And that's what they created. So is social media, and maybe this is corrective, maybe it's providing more opportunities. Karen, you look like you had a notion on this.
Well, just that I think, kind of picking up on something that Michael said, look, I think this is just a practical reality for anyone who's trying to reach audiences, whether it's a campaign, a candidate in a campaign, or selling a product. Media is so fractured, and the way we get our information now is so diverse, and the sources, right? I mean, it's as much about understanding who's using what source and how much do you trust which source you're getting it from. I mean, I get a lot of information from Twitter, but I don't really put a lot of stock in a lot of it if I can't check it out myself. That being said, I think one of the things that is really important, and again, I go back to us as all of us as political consultants in if this election reminded us of nothing, it is that we are a very diverse country. We are changing, like it or not. Black and brown people, we are here to stay. LGBTQ, and social media does provide new channels and ways for people to find each other and communicate with each other around the issues that they care about, because, as what Michael was saying, we don't see ourselves reflected in mainstream media. And so I think I know we sort of started with sort of misinformation and disinformation, and I certainly think that is a real problem, but I think also maybe part of the way we solve that is understanding how people are using social media, and what their expectations of what they're going to get from social media is. I mean, some of it, like this disinformation war room, part of the goal was to teach people how to not be part of, to be part of the solution, not the problem. Don't share disinformation and misinformation. Don't share something that says Joe and the hoe, because even if you think it's funny, because it's not funny, it's racist and it's sexist, and then it's out there, and then somebody who doesn't get that it's not funny sees it, right? And so I think part of this is also about understanding, I think that these platforms provide different channels for more diverse audiences. B, I think part of our task is also, though, to if we're going to let the market decide, then we've also got to give people the tools to be responsible consumers, because let's be honest. I mean, we know that there can be dangerous consequences to what happens on social media, and I think we all have to take some responsibility for that.
Yeah. Now, this is the part where we get to take some questions from audience members, which I've been doing a little bit all along, but there are more there, and from some of our fellow panelists who appear on screen, in particular one who I must now turn to, Joel Benenson.
He's dying to say something.
Of course he is.
I want to make a quick comment, and I'll get out of the way for the questions, but this notion of liberal media bias, I want to take it on. In 2016, on a Friday night, the Access Hollywood tape of Donald Trump came out talking about grabbing women by their genitals on a Friday. Shorenstein Center does a study of media coverage throughout the campaign. And over the subsequent 8 or 9 days of the campaign, the media covered Hillary Clinton's emails at a 3-to-1 ratio over the Access Hollywood tape. So I think if there was a liberal bias and it was going to rear its head at any point, it actually would have surfaced in the final 10 days, when you had great footage, great film, and great commentary, and it didn't happen. And I think we all need to be careful about that. The question, if I could put a question after that comment quickly to Patrick, as you're the academic on but I'd ask it of anybody who wants to answer. Should the media stop reporting on the horse race number in all these polls? I've often said the horse race number is often the least important number in a poll when it comes to learning what's going on in a race. Should the media really be just stop reporting it and report all the other rich data that's in the polls.
Yeah, Joel, I definitely agree with you that there's far too much emphasis on reporting those horse race numbers as we get more and more data points and more sophistication in how those data points are put together. I think there's been far too much emphasis put on it. You know, one thing that's kind of interesting is that you really do lose, I think this was particularly true in 2020, you really do lose any kind of conversation about what kinds of policies Americans want to solve problems. You know, this was, I think, what most people will call a very valence-focused election. Who's going to be the best at running either the economy or solving the coronavirus or both? But America faces a whole series of challenges that require pretty intense policy solutions that are going to require consensus for us to move forward. And I don't think that this campaign really moved us much along in that way. And I would agree that one way that the conversation would improve would be if we knew more what Americans think about, you know, the costly solutions to climate change, solving the deficit, reducing income inequality, because there's a lot of really difficult choices that we have to make as a country. And as far as I can tell, there's not a good sense of if there's a consensus and if there's consensus, what it is.
I've got a question from one of our listeners on exit polling. So how would you assess the validity of exit polling, considering the high number of mail-in ballots? If mail-in ballots remain as a primary mode of voting, how do you think exit polling will adapt?
Well, I got to tell you, there's always been some problem with exit polling. And the fact is that, you know, now that there's mail-in ballots, this isn't just, you know, exit polls. They have consortiums. It's not just people standing waiting for people to come out of the polls and to vote. They're now just doing large samples of phone interviews, right? And maybe some onlines, I don't know. So they're actually using polling techniques in the exit poll equation. But what we often find is that once an election happens, and you have to wait a certain time for what we call the voter file to be appended, and then you do analysis of who actually voted, you're going to see gaps between what you see in the exit polls and what you see by the rich data analysis that you get from from just knowing exactly who voted on the file, demographically, geographically, et cetera. And so I've always really cautioned people to take the exit polls with a grain of salt. And you can see some things in there right now. Matter of fact, you can see it with the suburban voters. I think that it's off. And I think that when you append the file and you do geocodes to suburban voters, you're going to see a difference in that as well. So it's not perfect. People take it as, you know, perfect, and it really isn't.
Yeah, I should just speak up for the exit polls as a proud member of the NBC decision desk this year. John's absolutely right, which is the polls are not designed to tell us, you know, who won. They're designed to eventually tell us who won and why, but they really only become insightful once they've been weighted to the final result. And so this year, particularly difficult because we're seeing such a huge change in the margin on election night and what will ultimately be the margin once all the votes are counted. So I would take all the exit poll data this year with a little bit of an extra grain of salt. At the same time, we are seeing already some evidence that the exit polls were picking up things that we're now seeing in the geographic vote, like the move toward Trump with Latinos. That's absolutely a real thing. It's across the board. It's across the board among Mexican Americans in South Texas, among Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans in Florida. And so, you know, it's certainly not a year to throw out the exit polls. And again, I just want to reiterate that the exit polls have really done quite a lot of work over the last few cycles, and especially this cycle, to make sure they capture people who are not voting in the booth on election day. They've got really sophisticated systems to figure that out.
I have maybe a slightly different take on exit polls. I'm not a fan. I'm sorry. I think they are disruptive. I think in some sense they're somewhat disingenuous as to what ultimately happens, and they feed a narrative sometimes that can come back to bite you on the behind. I get why they're there, because it's filler, because you don't have a result. and everybody's rushing at 5 o'clock, or excuse me, at 8 o'clock to start talking about those exit poll numbers as quickly as they can, because while they wait for results, and even before that, some will start early on sort of pushing out some exit polling number. The problem is that there's another part of the country that's still voting at 8 o'clock. And so when you start dropping all of this, I'll just use the affectionate term I have for it, crap, into the mix, you're impacting a vote that's in the 2 hours time zone and the 3 hour time zone behind you. So I think there's got to be a lot of tempering of all of this data and pushing it out and trying to configure and sort of, be the first to claim what happened and what the result means. Take a drink, chill, and let the results across the country unfold the way they need to. And we can do a day or two later some exit polling analysis to get to how we started this conversation around the why voters chose who they chose. I don't need to know at 6:30 in the evening why voters, what they said on their way out of the polls, when I know my cousin out in California is still voting, et cetera, because that's not necessarily going to tell me ultimately what voters decided to do and why.
I think this also, and I think watching nonstop television for 3 or 4 days after the election, I think that this first election where we saw this incredibly broad use of mail-in ballots, which may well presage a real turn to this, but everybody counts differently. And I think that it took days for the networks and for everybody who was talking about this to understand that just because they started counting those ballots early in Arizona didn't mean they were doing it every place else. And so it fed a narrative that I think was very simple for some folks to inject bad faith into and say, well, it went to the early narrative that somehow mail-in balloting was fraudulent. It is not fraudulent. Let's say that loudly and clearly. It's been studied endlessly, including by the Brennan Center for Justice. But I think those who are on TV, like all of you, next time around, it's going to be much easier for people to help understand what it means when mail-in ballots are counting and how that's different in different states. I have another question that I wanted to ask, and we've still got a little bit of time here if you guys are still okay. Is there a noticeable Heisenberg effect where people shift their votes on the basis of public polling? I've seen it suggested that some red state Biden voters decided to split their tickets and vote for GOP Senate candidates after polling indicated there might be a Democratic trifecta.
I believe in it. I believe in it. I think that that's part of what Joel was getting at. The fact is that there's a media narrative about the head-to-head horse race. It was, overblown, which is, let's just agree on that. And that people do, and we see this in focus groups, go into a checks and balances mind frame sometimes. And I think it potentially did help down ballot Republicans. Just a theory. Don't think there's any way to really get a diagnostic on it, but I think that it's a reasonable thing, and it can happen in the reverse.
Yeah, it's necessarily bad for democracy. So
I'm not saying one way or the other. I think it really happens.
Right. So I think if people want a balanced government and they learn something from polls that one thing is very likely to happen, one could argue it's actually quite good for democracy for people to be able to make a rational decision based upon those expectations.
Right? Anzo, I've got an insider question for you from a guy named Carl Rossow. You probably know that name. He wants to know if you found a difference in voters you got by methodology, phone versus SMS versus online.
Yeah, no doubt about it. If you're answering a landline, you're going to be older, right? You're more likely to be Caucasian. And so if you're looking just, for example, at party ID or generic ballot, it's going to be a little bit more conservative, a little more Republican. If you're answering by cell phone, you're more likely, again, to be disproportionately, not a ton Democratic, because we're getting now 65, 65% on cell. But again, if you're looking at panels, or I'm sorry, text to web, often depending on the state, and you're just doing a head-to-head on your phone, or you're going to, that's what we call peer-to-peer, or you're going to an online version where you don't have a phoner giving you some, a certain social pressure. We find those to be more conservative and Republican as well. And so I think they're important. I think we capture voters that we wouldn't capture by just doing one mode.
So this is a kind of big, tough question, but I'm curious how each of you might respond to it. How do we get people on each side of our political divide to come to a consensus on what's true versus not true? Any ideas?
I'll take the first bite out of that apple. At the end of the day, it is about our leaders kind of agreeing on that. I'm almost certain that during the Biden administration, there'll be a lot of Republicans standing up very quickly to say that's not true. And I'm sure there could have been more of that during the Trump administration. It really, in my view, a lot of the behaviors we're seeing being played out politically, in my estimation, and I may be on this island by myself, but I really believe from my own experience and just kind of being out across the country, certainly what I saw and felt and came to learn as national chairman in that 2009-2010 cycle with the emergence of Tea Party and all of those elements, is that the leadership, the sound from the leadership across party lines matters. And a lot of people take their cues off of that. I can tell you, and I'll just use the mask situation as an example. If the president of the United States had come out and emphasized the wearing of masks, you would not have had people protesting in state capitals with armed to their teeth talking about my civil rights not to wear a mask. And if that was reinforced across the aisle by Chuck Schumer, you would not have an Antifa backlash. So the reality of it is, I think the ongoing conversation and the tenor and tone of that is going to be set by our national leaders. We've kind of been built that way as a country over 244 years. And so when our leaders remain silent or they're off tone with the American people on a lot of these big issues and big questions, that's going to get filled in by now this new platform called social media. And they'll replace those voices that are absent in the public space that should be giving affirmation or condemnation, support or no support to these big public narratives.
Anybody else on that?
Lisa, I'll jump in. I think in a weird, messy, kind of maybe classically American way, we just had an election. We had record participation, record votes. Maybe we did get to the truth. I mean, with all the misinformation, with all the disinformation that we, as people who watch this, kind of bemoan and hate, if our goal was a fully engaged electorate that had stark choices put in front of them, maybe it wasn't done the way we would like to have had it done. Maybe we come to this, and there's a lot of studies that indicate the higher the education, the more closed-minded you become as you get older. Maybe it's not perfect, but maybe in all this mess and mix, we kind of, as consumers, I think Karen had a really great point. She said she sees stuff on Twitter, but until she verifies it and checks it and rechecks it, she's kind of suspicious. And I think we have a lot of consumers. The challenge we haven't talked about, and it's like a really technical, nerdy thing, but like the rise of bots on Twitter is like a real dangerous thing. And it creates a sense of herd that may not exist. And I found myself on election night going to a lot of data scientist tweets trying to figure stuff out, like if they were verifying what the herd was saying. And, maybe we all have to do that, and it takes time, but, I'm constantly amazed at, the rise of Rush Limbaugh, but also Joe Rogan and crooked media, that there's a large section of our people who want the truth, and they'll invest the time to do it. And so you kind of have to believe, we see the bad stuff, but there's a lot of good that is going into this. And, I had a lot of friends in school who hadn't probably voted ever, and they voted and they got engaged, and, they picked a side and they said, I'll stand up and voice my support for this or that. And that's not the end of the world. And, shifts in, as Patrick was saying, shifts in the Latino community and the African-American community towards Republicans, and, shifts in white men away from the Republican. I mean, it shows it's a dynamic marketplace. It's an ugly, gross, painful, lose sleep kind of marketplace some nights, but it doesn't change the fact that it works in a very inelegant way, but it does work.
We have to be able to decide, because, I'm concerned that, for example, as we saw in 2016, Black and brown voters were targeted with the subject of misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And one of our friends and colleagues, Donna Brazil, happened to be on a radio show the week before the election. And a Black man was saying, well, if Joe Biden wins, you're going to legislate feminism and you're going to legislate LGBTQ. And and it was clearly language that was coming from a bot or coming from somewhere that was not true, or even like the top cop language. When I've done, focus group works, when you talk with Black voters about that, it's like, well, we don't really talk like that. That's not how, like top cop, and that ain't really our wording, but okay. But, but you see that message enough and you think, okay, what does that mean? So I think let's be a little bit careful on that. I think there's a difference between, I think we're suffering from a crisis of two different things. There cannot be alternate facts, right? We started the Trump administration with a discussion about alternative facts about how many people actually attended the inauguration ceremony. There's a number of people who attended the inauguration ceremony, period, end of sentence. How you want to spin that is fine. Biggest ever in history, more people than ever, more around the world. Right, but I think we do have to, I agree with Michael to some degree that our leadership, and we all have to take some responsibility, we have to get back to some agreed upon actual facts, right? The sun is shining. That is an actual fact. That's not my opinion, right? That's not just my truth. That is a fact. I think within that, we can accept that, there is subjective truth about how we see that. And certainly there is, as a diverse nation, how we're going to, how Joe Rogan sees what the truth is going to be a lot different than Rachel Maddow, right? But there has to be, we have to get back to, I think, at least a place where we can say, okay, here's I feel like it's like high school science class, right? Where they would say, okay, here's the facts. And then you work the problem around the facts. And we may have some suggestive, again, subjective truth about how we see the facts, but can we at least get back to agreeing on that facts are not subjective, that there have to be some set of facts that we can all agree on and start from.
So I want to thank you all. I wish we were seeing each other in person. I can't believe no one's commented on Rob's beard. That is a primo, quarantine beard, Rob. None of us have seen him with that before. And
Actually, Rob, all this talk about social media, you look like it's a Jack Dorsey beard.
It allows me to
I don't say it's politics, Rob, just the beard. I don't say the rest of it.
I live in a town of 97% for the other guy, so I gotta hide. I gotta hide in plain sight.
We're nice people. We won't hurt you. We're nice.
Anyway, thank you all for participating in this today. It was great. And let me turn this over to Ellen Toscano.
Again, let me add my thanks to all of the panelists, to Lisa and Steve, for your brilliant moderating. I also want to thank C-SPAN for covering these 2 days. It increases our audience. That's great. I hope the audience, we will see you back tomorrow at 12:30 for 2 more panels on the future of the Democratic Party and the future of the Republican Party. Thanks to the panelists again for their insight and wisdom. And to the panelists, I'll see you in 15 minutes in the Limonaya.